Okay guys, welcome back to the channel. Thought I'd kind of parlay the recent videos I did on the SHD, which kind of touched into subwoofer setup and crossover points, with my subwoofer tutorial that I did in the past and kind of review of the REL 25, to kind of do a video that meshes the two together, how I set up my subs, but also because I just saw a video by REL. I'm a fan of REL, obviously I own their REL 25, and I was watching their channel on YouTube where John Hunter, I think is his name, did a video on how to set up the arrays if you buy, 6 of them. And that's a very common thing with REL subs. They kind of popularized the array model of setting up subs. And there's some merit, obviously, to that. A lot of people enjoy it. And as I was watching the video, it was obviously a very well done video. I mean, I was actually convinced he was listening to music. He's very good on the camera. He wasn't even really listening to music, but he was kind of showing in very detail how you would go through setting this up and pretending like he was even listening. Such that it was very convincing. And so there's a lot of things in there that could be helpful. But as I went through it, I was like, you know what? For a novice, or myself included, I would not be able to do some of the things that he did very easily. And I've found some alternative things and different options. And as well as he kind of just briefly touched on a few things in brief detail because his main goal was the array. But choosing phase, I thought might be worthwhile to go in a little more detail because novices often have a problem with that. And some of the how and why you would do an array versus a lot of other companies and experts like the swarm model, where you basically, if you have the ability to buy a lot of subs, move them around in the room, on the floor versus just stacking them in the same spot. So I thought I would do a video kind of just going through that video and where I might be able to provide you some experience and options if that's not working for you like he explained. But also real quick, the Spooktacular Audio Fest, for members, they've been seeing the updates in terms of what's going on behind the scenes. That's still a full go. And we've got animatronics, a lot of stuff planned. I think even MBL and Nordos are sending reps down. So if you can make that on October 30th, I'll put up the little flyer again. And let me know if you're going to be there, because I'll be there filming and like to meet some of you guys. I know Doug, my friend who's been featured in previous videos from New Orleans, he's flying down. So looking forward to seeing maybe some of you guys there if you can make it. Also, one other quick update that I'll share with you guys. I do that server project, which you may recognize from my prior videos, where I build my own servers. I think you've seen, maybe if you're on Facebook, some of the pictures going around of that Rune nucleus. What's inside of that just isn't high-end as far as I'm concerned, and not really a great value. So I build my own, and I do it selectively for a few other people. And, for subscribers of the channel, I consider doing it as well. But I'll show you. This could be a mistake here, probably. I'll probably have to just put up pictures. But here's my latest design. That's my test server. But yeah, a lot different from what you'll see inside of a nucleus. And yeah, this will have an 8 terabyte hard drive. I'll put up some better pictures. That was kind of tough to see. It's got a kind of a circuit board wood chassis. I try to do all unique chassis, something that's unique looking as well. So anyway, if any of that interests you, just let me know. Now, getting back to the subwoofer tutorial and the video that John Hunter did. Again, very well done. Should be very helpful to many. But the first thing I think may be worthwhile to talk about is, let's just talk about why you would do an array versus the swarm. I'm not dogmatic either way. Some people say you should always do the swarm, never do that array, and some others do say the opposite. Well, let me make sure I'm even here. Don't want to make you all dizzy. Anyway, let's talk about that briefly, because it really depends on a few things, in my opinion, whether you would use an array versus a swarm. First thing that he kind of pointed out, may not have been totally clear, but if you noticed, when he's doing the array, he puts the array really close to your front standing speakers. And so that's the first thing you need to know going in, is that the array should be fairly close. And the reason being is that if you listen to how he sets the crossover, the very top module is going to be crossed over very high. So it's going to have quite a bit of overlap with your main speakers. And that can be very problematic on its own, but especially if it's way in a different part of the room, because as I showed in my previous videos, crossing over a sub high means it will probably be playing as it rolls off into locatable frequencies, 200 hertz, 300 hertz or more. And so you'll be able to point to where those sounds are coming from. And as I showed with my video, even 6 inches doing measurements for Dirac changes things. So even if the subs are right next to your main speakers, you may have a little bit of a challenge and some things to overcome. But definitely putting them in the back of the room, an array, could be problematic just from the time alignment aspect. And then also colorations. Like he mentioned, if you put 6 subs reinforced with the back wall or a corner, it may be too much. So one thing right out the way, and then there's a coloration always with a closed-in space when it gets into those higher frequencies. So if you don't have the room to move that array close to your main speakers, then the array model may not be ideal. The swarm method, let's just briefly talk about that, is basically where you would spread out the subs throughout your room. They probably would all be crossed over the same and just be that low base reinforcement, but you're spreading out. And so let's think about it from the standpoint of a wave pool. A wave pool, you're in it and all the impulses are coming from one direction and they're pretty large, and then it got a back wave and then it creates the dips and nulls that we showed can happen at your listening position. Now, with bass traps and other things like I've done in my room, I don't really have those huge peaks and nulls. I'm in that plus or minus less than 10 dB, probably 8 or 9 at most. But you in your room may not have that ability to do all the bass traps, and when you take your measurements, you may have really big peaks and dips. So the theory is putting even more subs from the same perspective may only provide modest benefit or even make things worse at your listening position, even more impulse from one direction. Now, the swarm method says, hey, if you lower the levels and spread it out around the room, yeah, you're getting now still cancellations, but it's mitigated by not everything being hitting the super deep nulls and peaks that can occur when the reflections are a little more focused from one area. So it's something you might want to consider whether you do one versus the other, if you're lucky enough to be able to afford multiple subs, more than 2. In this case, you're talking about a pretty good investment, even with small RELs. And don't overlook as well the power delivery to such an array of subs or swarm. Here's some benefits of the array is that they're at least all with, in theory, your other equipment, usually where your equipment is. So you can all plug them into the same distributor box or maybe run a dedicated line. The problem with this swarm that I've seen is that when you're plugging them in all around the room, you're using different outlets and long runs of cables. And so that could be problematic. And then ground loops, because you're using different outlets around the room to spread them out. That's a problematic issue that I've seen. So there's a lot of things that I guess he didn't go into. I just wanted to share those, see if they may be applicable to you. Now, the other thing, though, that would make you decide whether you want to use an array or not is look at your main 4 standing speakers. In my case, I already have an array of bass drivers that handle pretty low, but also do the high bass in an array module already. I have 4 woofers, up to 7 feet tall in my room. So the benefits he's talking about with the array are real in terms of it does lift the soundstage. If I change my crossover points and have the subs do more than these, then yeah, you can feel the soundstage come down and the bass be kind of like most systems you go into. It's kind of hovering 50% below in the room, and it's not as imaged, or it's just normal for all systems, but you don't get that uniqueness that the array does. So if you've got speakers that already provide an array and that higher bass, even though I have the ability with my room not being bad to do an array, it's really not going to be conducive to me to do an array with these speakers, because then I would just be conflicting and have two drivers that are playing pretty high bass in two different, covering the same thing. But in the case where he showed there, where there's bookshelf speakers which don't go even low towards the high bass very powerfully, that could definitely provide a benefit. So look at your main speakers and decide whether the array or the swarm method would work. I think with speakers that aren't full range and don't go that low, you know, the array model can do a lot of good things. With a speaker that's already full range and you just want that bottom oomph, that like 40 hertz and below for, you know, powerful music, rap music, whatever, EDM, certain types of music to give that extra oomph, then the swarm, with all of them crossed over pretty low and you can't locate them anywhere, they're just kind of spread out, that would be probably your ideal choice in that situation. So let's talk about something else in the video that I think he might have overlooked and not going into too much detail, and that's phase. All right, with phase, he talked about just choose whichever setting, 180 or 0, is the loudest, and that's correct. The problem is that it's not as easy, especially for novices, to tell what phase is, and especially in his case, he was using a movie soundtrack instead of test tones. And even if you use pink noise, sometimes it's very hard to tell that which one's in phase. And really what you're trying to determine with phase is the woofer driver moving out and in the same as your main speakers? So if they're in concert with each other, they're in phase. If they aren't, they're out of phase. And so what's most likely to happen, what I've found that helps me determine phase, at some point you're going to get so good that it just sounds wonky. You don't even need to get an SPL meter or listen for volume. You just, when you're hearing music, you hear that gap or that little bit of phasiness that is unmistakable, but it takes a while to, and it's hard for me to even explain it, but once you get it down, it's very easy to tell. But from the initial perspective, you are going to want to listen for which one's louder, but it's best, instead of using program material, which you don't know what frequencies are playing, and you can get fooled because really, if you're rolling these off, the subwoofer may be playing almost all of what you're hearing if it's 30 hertz or 40 hertz tone at the time. And really what you want is a test tone that's right near that crossover point with your main speakers, because that's where you'll hear whether it's in phase or not. If you're picking something too high or too low where the subwoofer is barely playing or the subwoofer is playing almost everything, it's harder to tell that delta of the sound. So I think that if you're having trouble determining phase, pick a test tone at the crossover point you selected, and then listen with the switch on left or right and choose which one's louder there. And then you're going to pretty much kind of over time understand what phase is. I've gone to rooms at shows where their main speakers have been wired out of phase, and they didn't know because they're sitting off on the side usually at these shows and never sitting in the sweet spot, and they accidentally wired their speakers out of phase, and it's unmistakable. And so it's something you need to pay attention to and can really sabotage your results. So don't overlook that step in the process. Okay, so what else did he talk about that I can offer some different options and tips? When he's trying to set up time arrival, and he's basically pushing the speaker, he's sitting on one side of the sub and moving it to try to time align it with the main speakers. That's very difficult. I was watching that, I was like, and he's talking about getting it within the millimeter, and I'm like, how is he able to tell what's going to be time arrival at his listening position by just sitting on the side? His ears are closer to the sub than it is to the main speakers, but evidently he's done it so many times and he can kind of gauge it. And even once he sets it, then he even angles it in, toes it in after he sets it. So he's trying to factor in, and that moves it more than a millimeter. So he's obviously factoring in a lot of things that his experience and intuition do that probably the layperson that doesn't have that much experience is not going to be able to do that just quite as easy. So there are tools you can use to help you with that time arrival aspect, and measurement tools, that's perfect for them. Even if you don't use the direct filters, you can use direct to measure, and it will actually calculate time arrival from your left versus your right channel and your subs as well. So you can tell, just get the measurements from direct, and then if you're off, then you can manually move it if you want, or use direct and the DSP and it'll correct it for you automatically. So that's something, and then just use any kind of measurement tool to kind of help you with time arrival, because I just don't think the way he did it is going to be as easy as it seems. And even him, I don't know if that could be as precise as a microphone at your listening position, helping you with time arrival. The other thing that may be a little bit unclear in terms of things you have to factor in is stacking these subs creates a lot of vibration, and he even makes a point to say you got to put these brackets on these, or these things will shake right off of there. So my concern has always been with, you know, the arrays, is that why would I want to add vibrations to things that are, their purpose is to create precise vibrations? So creating a stand that's going to be vibrating a lot and impacting the drivers, you know, that are being vibrated, I just was a little bit concerned that that gets overlooked as a potential negative. So in most cases, bass is not something that people worry about from a distortion profile. The distortions are pretty high when you actually measure bass, and people aren't annoyed by it. So I don't think the vibration issue is as bad as, let's say, with a turntable if you had it on a vibrating surface, or even other drivers in cabinet enclosures. But you've seen in my videos, some speaker makers put a lot of effort into controlling vibrations in a cabinet, and they do it for a reason. So when you go into an array, just realize you're not creating a better environment for those drivers to behave. You're creating a much more vibrant vibrant, I guess is the analogy I'm using here, environment for those drivers to behave, which probably is not optimal. So if you're super neurotic about vibrations and vibration control, an array may not be optimal for you. But if you do, you need to put those braces on, because those subs can easily fall off if you don't. Now, the only other thing that he glossed over at the end is hooking it up via, he uses the high-level connections, and at the end he talks about if you're going to use the LFE input from a surround sound processor, or if you have a DSP like I've got with SHD, a lot of your crossover and stuff is going to use kind of that input. And I wanted to just talk about REL's philosophy, which is fine, and I give them credit for offering two different options for hooking up your sub. The high level, if you don't have crossover, you don't have DSP, that's great to have that option. And they have the option, obviously, with the LFE. So having those two options, they deserve props for that. The problem I have that I like to share with people is that some people think because they offer that high level, and they do promote it pretty highly, that that's the best method. Again, like everything, it's not always the best for everybody. If you don't have a crossover and whatnot, it's a great option to have. But their theory behind it is that you get the flavor of your amp by using the terminals off your amp into their sub. But just realize you're not using the power from your amp. You're just using the signal off of your amp terminals, and it's going into their amp. You know, so I don't know how you keep the same flavor of your amp when it's going into their plate amp on the back of their speaker. But that's their theory behind it. And so just kind of think it through logically whether that's going to really work for you or not. And what I'm going to probably do in a future video is show how I set up my REL with the SHD in more detail, and how important it is to, in my opinion, use the other method, where the biggest drawback with that high level method, in my opinion, is that you don't roll off your main speakers. So you just have to rely on however your main speakers roll off, and it could be choppy. And then what's that going to do to the sum component of the REL and your main speakers? If this one's rolling off choppy and your REL is picking up but on an even, it's going to make the results choppy. So there's just no way around it. I mean, if you can't mate your main speakers to every other driver in your speaker is designed, every speaker maker designed it so that they hand off well, and they hand off perfectly. Both sides roll off so that they, can operate optimally together. When you do this high-level connection, you're basically saying, hey, speaker, whatever your speaker driver, no matter what it is, just rely on it to do its own thing, and we're going to fill in the rest perfectly. It just doesn't happen that way. Depending on your quality of your speakers and how they naturally roll off, you could have a great roll off that blends seamlessly at whatever crossover point you choose on the REL, or it could be a mess, and then you've got peaks and dips based on how much overlap you've got. So, and then you do have limited number of slopes you can choose with the REL, that you don't have when you have the options of an SHD and digital crossover. You can try all different types of slopes to perfectly match your main speakers to your sub, whether it's a REL or not. So just be cognizant of that just because they promote that high level input and give you that option, which is a positive, in my opinion, it's not always going to sound best. There are other ways and other options to consider, and I just thought I'd share some of these ideas with you, see if any of them resonate and help you. If so, sign up, subscribe, and I'll be back soon with more.